The people of Hawaii and all Americans are rightfully concerned about how this trade deal will impact our jobs, our families, our economy, our environment, and our nation's sovereignty. I'm rising today in strong opposition to H.R. 1599, which actually stands in direct contradiction to the wishes of almost 90% of Americans across the country. It's no wonder that this legislation has more commonly become known to people who are very concerned about this issue as the DARK Act, or the Deny Americans the Right to Know Act. Yesterday, the new Trump-appointed FCC chair announced his mission to undermine the net neutrality rules that we fought so hard to put in place. In 2015, over 4 million people submitted comments calling on the FCC to keep the internet open and fair.
Capitol Hill Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard has introduced a measure that would prohibit the use of taxpayer dollars to settle sexual misconduct claims against members of Congress.
Through marketing lies and other over-distribution of these dangerously addictive drugs, they've oversaturated parts of our country, already struggling from high levels of addiction, while knowing but not disclosing their highly addictive nature and risks. I can't keep track of how many times I've heard from veterans across generations who have seen firsthand the cost of war. They are some of our greatest champions for peace. Cost of war on the people of these countries where the United States has gone and waged these regime change wars. What to speak of the cost on our nation's treasure. When we look, for example, at the trillions of dollars that have been spent on these regime change wars since 9/11 alone, and then we look in our communities and we look at failing infrastructure, contaminated water, poorly resourced education, the lack of universal health care. This bipartisan legislation will secure critical funding for flood risk management, both on the Alawai Canal, other places in Hawaii and across the country, helping to provide that necessary safety and security for our residents. This is a critical piece of bipartisan legislation that deserves the support of Congress. Let's take this opportunity to better the lives of our constituents, residents across the country by strengthening our national infrastructure and ensuring clean and safe drinking water for all. When a person thinks, I'm a Christian, this other person is a Muslim, and therefore he is my enemy, or I'm a Muslim, this other person a Hindu, therefore she is my enemy, this reveals a lack of their own spiritual depth and understanding. No religion teaches this. Any understanding of any religion that adopts this divisive attitude proves itself false by doing so. I urge my colleagues to vote for our bipartisan USA Rights Amendment today, which maintains necessary authorities to keep the American people safe while also simultaneously protecting our civil liberties. The DNC needs to be completely overhauled to take our party back from the special interests of a powerful few and put it back in the hands of the people.
A proposed bill banning the manufacture, sale, and use of bump stocks, co-sponsored by Hawaii U.S. Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard today. It's legislation making it a violation of law, a felony, and increased penalties for offenders.
Some are calling it the Agent Orange of the post-9/11 generation.
And right in the middle of it, as Kelly Meyer from our Washington Bureau reports, is Hawaii U.S. Representative Tulsi Gabbard.
There's no research or mandatory tracking system in place on which veterans were exposed to these burn pits, what the effects on their health have been, how many there have been, and this all must happen in order for the follow-on action by the VA to take place. It's been over 1,500 days since this crisis began, and the people of Flint today still do not have clean water. I'm a co-sponsor of the Water Act, which will make these critical improvements to our drinking water and wastewater services, replace old, lead-ridden pipes, and stop sewage overflows and other problems that are contaminating our national water infrastructure. We must hold those responsible for the poisoning of Flint accountable for the lives that they have ruined. So proud to be a co-sponsor of the Trafficking Survivors Relief Act because it creates this promise of freedom for those survivors from the shackles of their past. Families belong together. I joined over 190 of my colleagues to introduce the Keep Families Together Act to prevent migrant children from being taken away from their parents at the border. I decided I will no longer accept money from any political action committees. Each of us wants to be free. But if we want to be free, we also need to appreciate that others also desire the same thing. If we don't want others to trample on our individual free will, then we must be careful not to trample on the free will of others. I urge my colleagues to sign the discharge petition to bring the DREAM Act to the floor for a vote so we can pass a permanent solution for Josue and millions of dreamers across the country. Our nation made a promise to these young men and women. We must uphold that promise. Protecting our water is not a partisan political issue. It is an issue that is important to all people and all living beings everywhere. Water is life. We cannot survive without it. Once we allow an aquifer to be polluted, there is very little that can be done about it. This weekend, I'm joining thousands of veterans from all across the country at Standing Rock to stand in solidarity with our Native American brothers and sisters. I've long been a proponent of restoring the Glass-Steagall Act and look forward to being able to continue to work with allies and partners here in Congress, in the White House, and most importantly, the American people whose voices must be heard.
Expect me to call for the overthrow in the Syrian government, but I refuse. I do not support one side or the other in the conflict in Syria. I stand for my suffering people.
Tima is in Washington as a guest of U.S. Representative Tulsi Gabbard, who recently introduced the Stop Arming Terrorists Act, which, according to her office, would stop the CIA or other federal government agencies from using U.S. funds to provide arms, funds, intelligence, and other support directly and indirectly to armed militants allied with terrorist groups like al-Qaeda and ISIS. Gabbard, a Democrat, says it's a genuine way to address the tragic struggle of refugees.
There's a lot of conversation about what to do with refugees, how many to take, how should they be vetted. But the most important question is how do we address the cause of these people fleeing their homes? Even as this whole wait time scandal has erupted, as we've learned more and more about all of the horrific actions that took place where veterans who were waiting for care died while waiting, no one has been prosecuted for any of these actions. And accountability is the most important thing that needs to happen here. I'm rising today to urge my colleagues to support H.R. 1227, the Ending Federal Marijuana Prohibition Act. This is an issue about people, and every single one of us represents constituencies all across the country where people are struggling, working more than one job, living in poverty, trying to put food on the table. This is an issue that has stagnated for far too long. It is our responsibility and our opportunity to do the right thing, to do the moral thing for people all across this country. I'm proud to be here and stand with my colleagues in this and look forward to seeing this legislation pass. I'm introducing the Securing America's Elections Act, which will not only provide the American people with a voter-verified, reliable, and independent paper record of their votes that can be implemented before the 2018 elections, but it will also address the effectiveness and security of our electronic voting software. I'm an original co-sponsor of H.R. 525, the Industrial Hemp Farming Act, which would permit the cultivation of industrial hemp in the United States. There's an important bill that I've co-sponsored, H.R. 676, which is the expanded Medicare for All bill,
that would address many of the issues that we see with the current healthcare system. The foremost of which is it takes insurance companies completely out of the equation.
My bill, the Off Fossil Fuels for a Better Future Act, which would transition our country away from fossil fuel sources to 100% renewable energy by 2035.
This, my friends, is a movement of love. Love which calls upon us to care for families torn apart by our criminal justice system, to care for folks whose jobs have vanished because of destructive trade deals, to care for those barely scraping by at minimum wage and those crippled by college debt, to care about our environment and future generations, to care about lives lost, lives ruined, and countries destroyed by counterproductive regime change wars. To care for our veterans who have put their lives on the line for our country, who now face unacceptable delays and inadequate care.